let me begin, and don't get uneasy here, because as you know, when parents talk about their kids, often you go off to your happy space, right? And stop listening. But I'm going to actually open with an anecdote. Some of you probably have heard this from my daughter Isabel. This was probably 2 years ago. We were spending a lot of time on the battlefield, and they were just starting to grasp the idea that a lot of men had been killed here. And so, of course, they were intrigued. Why did this happen? I read him a bedtime story, and Isabel turned to me and said, "Why was there so much killing here at Gettysburg?" And she said, "Well, what did the South do?" Well, I was like, "Sweetheart, we got a long evening ahead of us. You just asked me a big question for a historian, right?" So I thought, okay, you know what? I'm going to simplify this for her. I said, the South decided to leave the United States and to form its own nation. And she said, "What the hell?" Now, let me be clear here. That poor language choice was, of course, the influence of her mother. And I can prove this. Their mom's a Jersey girl. You know how Jersey girls are, right? I'm an innocent, sweet Midwestern boy. If I'd stayed with my own kind, something like this would have happened. But you know, Isabel hit it. She nailed it. And I'll be honest with you, I thought, why did I spend all this time getting a PhD? Because what the hell were Southern slaveholders thinking when they decided to leave the Union? Because within the Union, as you all know, their beloved institution of slavery was protected. This act of secession was an incredibly reckless and a suicidal one. When in fact, again, we got to remind ourselves that Abraham Lincoln guaranteed protection of that institution where it currently resided. As we all know, it was the Western Territories where the debate, the contention, where that resided. So this act of secession that ultimately led to war, one reason why it was also suicidal, because it had to fall on the backs of ordinary white Southerners. Ordinary white Southerners who had a conflicted relationship with the slaveholding class and with the institution of slavery. This is something, again, we can discuss during the question and answer period. It is a topic that elicits all kinds of really emotional debate, and it misses something very fundamental. It misses the difference between what caused the war and why soldiers fought. And the typical argument that is rolled out by people who want to extract the Confederacy from slavery, they just make the simple point: most white Southerners didn't own slaves. The fact that they didn't own slaves, then how can you possibly conclude that this issue, the peculiar institution, was something that they fought and died for? And this is a great deal. And I'll just simply say this, and again, we can come back to this during the question and answer period. White Southerners of all social classes were embedded within a social and economic system that was defined by human bondage. To think for a moment that these people, even if they didn't own a single slave, somehow existed outside that dominant system is to say that poor people today, a person working at a Quickie Mart, is somehow outside the system of capitalism. Somebody who's making minimum wage today, I suspect, has very similar aspirations, hopes, and values. I hate to say it, but like a person like Donald Trump, right? There is an overlap, at least there, of values and ideas and aspirations, and those things are deeply rooted in a very materialist way in slavery. Now again, we can come back to this, and I hope that we do in the question and answer period. Because today we're going to talk about a soldier who's probably his story. It's not a story that is especially familiar to you all. It is a story of a non-slaveholder. It is a story of a man who was semi-literate. It's a story of a man who got caught up in a war that was really beyond his comprehension. It's a story of a man who did not want to be in the Confederate Army. But it is a story of a man who, of course, was controlled, constrained, overwhelmed by forces that he ultimately had to not give his consent to, but that he had to accept, acknowledge. We did this marvelous walk yesterday. It was perfect weather. Going across Pickett's Charge, again, you can't help but to think about, reflect on this great act of collective political action. Those men, shoulder to shoulder, marching across those fields, it reinforces that idea of solidarity across class lines. And there is no doubt that's exactly what happened on July the 3rd. That image is powerful, it's overwhelming, but what we have to do is break beneath that image. Because there were moments like that. They're indisputable. But after the battle, when the soldiers were reflecting upon what they had just endured, we can see, can hear many different voices. Those voices collided together. But the voices that you all have been hearing are the voices of the most literate, most educated, the most powerful, the most privileged. Those are the voices that you have heard. Those are the voices that historians, God, that could have been tragic. Those are the voices that you have heard. Those are the voices that historians have focused on because we have drawn from the letters and diaries of the most educated. I talked a little bit on Friday about the work, the scholarship on why the soldiers fought. And of course I identified James McPherson's For Cause and Comrade. If you haven't read it, you should pick it up. It is a very important book. It is a book that allows us to appreciate that Civil War soldiers were deeply political and at times highly idealistic. That argument is a persuasive and it is a powerful one. But there is a problem in that literature. That problem is the question that we continue to ask. And that question is, why they fought. It has us focus, hone in on motivation. And so then we turn to these letters again, that are highly scripted. They're sculpted. Because it is the moment for a soldier to do what? Not to reveal to the folks back home why he is confused, but it is the moment to bring clarity to one's experience. Did they believe it when they wrote that? Of course they did. But they only captured that moment. A letter, a diary, is a reformatting of an experience. What did James McPherson and many other historians, what have they done? They've used letters and diaries as transparent windows. You can then look into the minds, the hearts of these soldiers, and you can just recover the hard ideas that these men believed in. I believe that it's much more complicated and confusing than that, but I believe that our task in trying to crack open that world is extraordinarily difficult, especially when you deal with the educated. They're confined and constrained by their own cultural upbringing. They come from a world in which sentimental influences prevail. Those sentimental influences, I dodged it at times. These sentimental influences pressured them to find an experience, in their experiences, something that was ennobling, something that had a higher cause, something that's inspiring. So when they sent their letters home, we have to remind ourselves of this, they were sending it home to a very specific audience, to try to shape a very specific reaction. So the horror, the hell of war, such as Pickett's Charge. If you look at the letters of the survivors on the Confederate side who are from the educated class, they take that horror and that hell and they translate it into what? A drama. A drama with a beginning and an end. A drama that has a resolution. A drama that should in fact do what? Remind the people back home of this great and noble sacrifice. What's lost? The confusion, the chaos, the blood, the smoke, the terror. It's almost entirely erased from their letters. Except if you look at the letters from the poorly educated. They're hard to find for all the obvious reasons. Those who are on the margins of society, who are able to write letters home, their families, because of their economic or social class, often did not preserve or keep those letters. The irony is that we don't have access to the vast numbers of Civil War soldiers on both sides who are right on the front. We get the vision of the privileged and the educated who, again, they take war, put it through a sentimental filter, and for the people back home, it is something that is not just digestible, but something that allows them to inspire the sacrifices of, and to appreciate the sacrifices of those in the ranks. So John Futch, he's a fascinating individual because I'm quite certain that he might have been illiterate, certainly semi-literate, but he has a body of correspondence. Pretty sure that he was illiterate because he, at times, makes reference in the letters of having, in essence, a translator. But his translator was barely literate. The bottom line is simply this. This was a man who was a reluctant Confederate. This was a man who fumbled, who struggled to put his experiences on paper. But here is the opportunity. He's not confined by Victorian sentimental ideas. He feels no pressure to take the horrors of this battle and to do what? Write it into a great act, a great play. What comes out of John Futch is the raw ugliness of war. You can feel the vibration of battle in his letters. You can sense his utter despair. We have always looked to World War I as that moment in our history when we were finally given access to the real war. It's the birth of modernism. I would suggest to you all that if you want to find that realistic rendering of combat, turn to our Civil War and look at the letters of the uneducated and the poor. The picture I have in front of you of Confederate prisoners, a very famous one taken less than a half a mile over at the seminary. This is the picture, this is the image that resonates with us today. Because it is the image of the Confederate soldier who was resolute, determined, and above all else, look at that, clear-eyed. They're looking to the future, really sort of undefeated, right? Unconquered. But there is nothing in their pose, in their glare, that would suggest anything but men of determination. The work on why the soldier fought leads us to see Civil War soldiers from this angle. What we need to do, of course, is to bring multiple images together. Photo taken of men of Kershaw's brigade near the Rose Farm. Someone told me that if, in fact, you go on the Library of Congress site, you can blow up the images, and on those boards you can actually identify the names of the soldiers, which is quite remarkable. From Drew Faust's brilliant work on death in the Civil War, we know how shocking, how overwhelming it was for Civil War soldiers to come to grips with this. The fact that their comrades, men that they loved, men that they knew from their lives prior to the war, from either family relations or community relationships, that to leave men buried in pits like this was absolutely overwhelming. It was not the good death that they had imagined. The earlier photo of the clear-eyed soldiers looking to the future, we need to remind ourselves that every man had to come to grips with this, and And the consequence was that what happened here, or on any Civil War battlefield, never brought to them some kind of epiphany about the meaning of the war. It was always confused. It was always baffling to them. There were moments, of course, when they understood what was at stake. But those moments would pass, and they would have to come to grips with this. So the central point of this talk, which you'll see, I hope, in the words of John Futch, is, and this is what we have to try to recapture in our studies of Civil War Americans, is to know and not know at the same time. To know and not know at the same time. We have to bring back those contradictions, those tensions that resided in every one of those historical actors. We have to move away from that photo of the Confederate prisoners. That photo, of course, which leads us to believe that these men knew exactly why they fought in every single instance. To know, to not know at the same time. That is the critical challenge. Let me add one quick point to that. Instead of asking why they fought, instead of focusing on motivation, why not focus on what was the question that soldiers asked themselves day in and day out? How do we survive? How do we survive? By asking how do they survive, we do something very important that scholars have not done to date, and that is, you bring the high ideas that we find in those letters and diaries, and you connect it to what was happening on the ground. There's a gap in the literature, and that gap is between James McPherson's studies on ideology and the classic work by Bell Wiley. Bell Wiley wrote 2 books, Life of Johnny Reb and The Life of Billy Yankee. Brilliant books. He focused on the social history, the daily life of Union and Confederate soldiers. So great works. We've got to find that meeting ground. And we can't, again, forget ourselves, and I suspect we have a lot of soldiers out in the audience here, that what men are concerned about, above all else, every single day when they wake up, how to get through the day, how to survive. We really haven't asked that question in a direct way, at least some more scholars have. Futch will help us do that. All right, let's turn to John Futch. As I mentioned before, Futch, from North Carolina, the eastern part of the state, he was a non-slave holder. In 1861, he lost his wife. They had a child. 1862, in February, he remarried. And in March of 1862, he was conscripted into the Confederate Army. He joined the 3rd North Carolina with his brother Charlie. For the first year of the war, John was sick most of the time. Spending, shuttling between the Army and between the hospital, sometimes spending his downtime in isolation in his tent. He was absolutely miserable. He wrote this to his wife. My health is so bad and it is so cold here that I am perfectly miserable. And I am doing my country no good and myself a great harm. Futch's wife, in getting these letters, she started to implore him to take his case to a medical board of examiners. She continued to press him, and again, this is one other thing we need to realize in this quest to survive, are the forces that came down on Futch, these conflicting pressures, right? He's now been conscripted in the Army, he is sick. His officers and his doctors, for whatever reason, don't believe that he is sick enough to send him back home. He's now getting letters from his wife, pressuring him to take care of himself, make sure you get through this thing, but also, she continued to press him to go back to the board of medical examiners. And this is really interesting. I just noticed this the first time when she said, I learned that you have not been going before the medical board. So obviously from a neighbor, from somebody else, she discovered that he had not gone back to get examined by the doctors. I learned that you have not been going before the medical board, and I want you to go. If you wanted to come home as bad as I do want you to come, you would go before it every day. And I want you to get home and try to get home. For the entirety of Futch's military career, he received depressing letters from his wife. They're sort of like, I guess she's semi-literate, they're almost like tweets. They almost are, this has obviously more content and substance than tweets do, but they're just little shards of information. I've read these letters a million times. I have no idea how John Futch made any sense of this except to conclude things are falling apart at home. She writes, of course, that the family is desperately ill, in need of food, and then some bizarre things that make utterly no sense. That women in the community were dressing up as soldiers and terrorizing Confederate soldiers who were being hospitalized. Again, that's it. That's all she writes. Again, how Futch made sense of this, God, who knows? But here again is the point. Every single day that man wakes up, what does he think about? He thinks about a wife and a child who's in a situation that's utterly untenable, unsalvageable. It's been destabilized. And so that pressure is a constant force in Futch's daily existence. Futch finally gets into combat. You've read plenty of letters of where soldiers, after they emerge from fighting, they have this renewed sense of comradeship. Not John Futch. John Futch, his first battle was Chancellorsville. Great Confederate victory, as you know. There is nothing in his letters, nothing, in which he pays homage to God for this great Confederate victory. There is nothing celebratory about Robert E. Lee, and there is no lamenting the loss of Stonewall Jackson. And here again is the thing that I would impress upon all of you. When you read Civil War letters, read for the silences. Read for the silences. Imagine at that time, after Chancellorsville, euphoria across the Confederacy. Everyone, of course, signifies Confederate victory as coming from the blessings of God, and John Futch doesn't buy it. Doesn't play within that trope. For him, what happened at Chancellorsville was pure terror. Horrific carnage. The quote that I read to you on Friday about a soldier who perceived that a man had defecated in his pants, that was John Futch. That's what he remembered from Chancellorsville. What comes through in Futch's letters, again, is not some tribute to the noble Christian Confederate soldier. He didn't see himself that way at all. He understood how tenuous life was in the ranks of the army, how entrapped he was, how his family, again, was right on the edge of destruction, and that fatalism pervades his letters. Futch writes, on the eve of the Gettysburg campaign, I hope I will get home sometime before I die. I hope I will get home sometime before I die. He stood in the ranks with his brother Charlie. That obviously must have made his situation a little bit more bearable. They made their way with Lee's army into Pennsylvania. On July the 2nd, they participated in the assault against Culp's Hill. As the 3rd North Carolina made its advance, Charlie and John were on the ground. They were loading their weapons, firing, and John noticed that his brother had been hit. Union bullet had creased Charlie's forehead. When he turned Charlie around, Charlie's mouth was moving to speak. Nothing came out. John left the ranks, carrying Charlie with him. Agonizing evening, as you can imagine. John said that Charlie suffered a great deal. There was nothing that he could do for him. Early morning hours of July the 3rd, John buried Charlie, knowing that he would never see his body again. He wrote to his family, John did, confessing that he was absolutely devastated, that he never thought that he, in fact, would have to leave his brother on soil that he would never again get to revisit. And all he had from his brother, 2 pistols. Pistols that he sent back home to North Carolina. Pistols that he asked his family to always keep so that he would have some reminder of his brother. John wrote, Poor feller, he got killed a long ways from home. I was very sorry that I couldn't get a coffin to bury him, but I buried him the best I could. It was something that I never expected to have to do. His final remark: I believe Charlie is happy, he told his family, and no doubt far better off than any of us. I'm going to have, hey Becky, I'm going to need somebody to advance this. It's not working for somebody who needs to come up. If you all could turn to your letter. This is one of the many letters that John Futch, again, I think he dictated, in essence, this to another soldier. I'm not 100% sure of that. But he dictated a number of letters after the Gettysburg campaign. And I'd like for us to take a moment to read that. I'm going to pull the letter up on the screen here as well, but you have one right in front of you. And I'll help read it to you. I'm not sure which one. And in fact, I'll read it out loud to you because the prose is a little jagged, rough around the edges. July 31st, 1863. I seek myself to drop you a few lines in which will inform you that I am well, and I hope these lines will reach you safe and find you enjoying good health. I have not had any letter from you in a good while, but I reckon it is owing to our marching. We do not get mail only once in a great while. We are on our way towards Richmond, but I do not know whether we will get there or not. But hope we will. I would like to come home, but I do not know how. When I will get the chance to come home again, I will come home long if I have to run away to do it. I have no news of importance to write you. These times are very hard here. Good. I want you to write to me as soon as you can and get this. Of course, this is a different letter. Not sure how this happened. What dated letter do you all have? 31st. Oh, no, here it is. Oh, I'm sorry. There we go. Take to the 19th. I'm very sorry. I didn't know that they had a two-sided. All right, July 19th. That's really the better letter. We can go to the 19th. Great. Thank you. Here it is. The pleasure of writing you a few lines which will inform you that I am not well at this time. I have had a bad cold, and basically said I'm worn out. I'm marching. But we are stopped at this time, but we don't know how long we will stay there. There is some talk of our going back into Maryland, but I am in hopes that the war will soon end, for I am tired of Maryland. I hope that we will not go back through where we marched. I think it means PV, meaning Pennsylvania. We had a hard fight there. We lost all of our boys nearly there. Charlie got killed, and he suffered a great deal from his wound. He lived a night and a day after he was wounded. We've seen hard times there, but we got enough to eat there. But we don't. Now, as to myself, I get enough, meaning he's not getting enough food now. For I don't want nothing to eat hardly, for I am almost sick all of the time and half crazy. I never wanted to come home so bad in my life. But it is so that I cannot come at this time. But if we come down south, I will try to come anyhow, for I want to come home so bad that I am homesick. I want you to keep Charlie's pistol, and if I ever get it back, I will keep it. Thomas and Robert Ramsey both got wounded, and they was left with the Yankees. But I hope that we will lifted to come home without a wound, for I have seen so many wounded and died. I stayed with Charlie until he died. He never spoke after he was wounded until he died. Until he died, I was never heard so in my life. I'd rather that it have been myself. As any opportunity is had of writing, I will close, so nothing more. Look, it's almost stream of conscience, isn't it? How jagged it is. The man's going from point to point. It's very, of course, challenging for us to follow, but you can get a sense, you can get an access to his mental state. And I'll remind you again of the beautifully sculpted letters that we have read from highly literate Civil War soldiers. They're nothing like this at all. I would argue that a man like John Futch was actually liberated by the simple fact that he wasn't educated. He didn't have that literary style, that structure that took those experiences and funneled them into a well-formatted account. The last paragraph was actually the most tragic. It is to his mother. Dear mother, I want to let you know that I had not forgot you. Now, never will as long as I live. I wrote to you 2 or 3 times and never have got any answer. I want to see you the worst in the world and talk with you. I will write to you before long and write you a long letter. Don't forget to write to me, for it is all the satisfaction I see. Is to there from you all. So I will close for the want of something to write, so nothing more. Here again is a striking thing. He says, I have so much I want to tell you. Again, another reminder that for most of these men, the act of writing was a foreign act. They spent most of their time communicating in very close face-to-face relationships. And I point all this out so that we don't take these letters and believe that we have found the Holy Grail, because we have not. We have to penetrate, we have to cut through these letters. And we have to recognize the limitations of that act of communication. So, I'm asking you all now, we have some time. What's going on with John Futch after Gettysburg? What's going on with John Futch? And if you can just yell out, you don't need to use the mics here, I'll repeat your voice. Okay, so we have one thing, he's depressed. Let's talk about what's the basis of this depression. Okay, so his brother's been killed. He's obviously in deep mourning. Anything else about the depression?
Questioning the cause he's fighting for.
Okay, so we got 2 points here. Let's go first with the homesick. He's clearly homesick, right? He misses his family dearly. He's obviously having irregular communication with them. So there is he's longing for home. That pervades this letter. We had someone who said post-traumatic stress syndrome. Post-traumatic disorder. Okay, so the point that was just made was that nobody was helping him. He did not have a support system. I think that's a really interesting idea. Counters what we often think about with Civil War soldiers, that overwhelming connection to comrades, right? Again, there's ample evidence of that. I'm not denying its existence. But clearly, John Futch doesn't feel that sense of bond. Excellent point. Post-traumatic stress disorder, what do you all think about that? What's that? Good, Jim?
A sense of helplessness.
Good. So the point that was just made was a sense of utter helplessness and despair and entrapment. No question about that. What about post-traumatic stress disorder? That's what he's going through? We can't tell. That's exactly right. I mean, just because a man writes, hey, I'm going half crazy, doesn't mean that that's what he's suffering from. He's certainly struggling with those memories and those emotions. But remember what I mentioned on Friday is that I think a more accurate definition of PTSD is that the memories, they overwhelm the individual in a way that is not controllable and, of course, can lead to then dysfunctional behavior. There's no sense of time with PTSD. No sense of time. We don't know. That could be the case here, but clearly the man is struggling. Someone in the back mentioned Confederate loyalty, so I put something about that. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, sit here.
I just said that I think he's questioning what he's fighting for, because I don't think he has a strong sense of.
Good, excellent point. Okay, but we might have some disagreement here. The point was that John Futch, he is in fact questioning the Confederate cause. So I'll ask you, was this a political letter? No, not a political letter at all. Not yet. Not a political letter. Anyone else? We have, although this young woman believes that it is, and it was a statement against the Confederate cause.
No, I don't think it's a statement against the Confederate cause. I think he's missing his family, and I think he's internally, not saying we shouldn't be doing this. I think he's saying, I don't know what I'm here for, type of thing.
What would make this a political letter? Yeah, go ahead. What would make this a political letter?
He said he was going to try and get home anyhow.
He did, I know. I revealed his hand a little bit, but I didn't realize that this had been done beside him. Again, I apologize for that. He does say in that other letter that he's thinking about running away, so we're getting a glimpse. But you've now helped me make another, I think, important point here. Do you realize how often we generalize about Civil War soldiers by extracting a tiny little quote from a single letter and saying, hey, this is how the Army felt? I mean, it's just so utterly false. Can you imagine anyone doing this? God help me if someone takes my emails and extracts a line from one of my emails during my life. But God knows what kind of portrait they can come up with. And not a very good one, I'm afraid. But we need to remind ourselves of that. If we just had access to this single letter that you've just read, that's all you had, nothing else. It appears that most of you would conclude not a particularly political letter, not a man who is in opposition to the Confederacy, a man who feels hopeless, a man who's ready to do what? Somehow get out of this war. If we only had this one letter, but obviously we have more than that, and it should again remind us of the great care we need to take when we read a single letter and we don't get the breadth of an entire correspondence. So let me again ask you, what would make this political? What would make this letter political? Yeah, go ahead, young man out there.
Talking about maybe the causes and effects of the war.
Okay, so if they're talking about the causes of the Civil War, or maybe the policies of the Confederacy, or criticizing Jefferson Davis, criticizing the generals, and so I'll leave it to this, and I want to finish the Futch story for you. Let me suggest that for many of us, our idea of what constitutes political is far too narrow. And we read a letter like this and we think that it's apolitical, and in many ways it sort of reaffirms our understanding of Confederate soldiers. Man, it was all about home and community to these guys. There's no great abstractions here. There's no politics at work here, man. These are just simple guys wanting to get home and restore their family life. I'd agree. That's completely true. But that's also deeply political. Those private relationships with family, with your wives, with your children, with your community, the love and attachment that you have for those basic building blocks are deeply political. And that you don't need a man to critique the policies of the Confederate government, or to damn Jeff Davis, or to call Robert E. Lee a fool for what he did on July the 3rd, for it to be a political letter. August 21st, 1863 was a day set aside by R.E. Lee and Jefferson Davis for prayer. There were great revivals that swept through the camps of the Army of Northern Virginia. Many of those camps were around Charlottesville, around Orange County. And on that day of the great revivals, John Futch and 10 other comrades, they decided not to go to the revivals. Instead, they got their muskets, they got their cartridge boxes, and they deserted. 4 days they covered about 50 miles, passing near Charlottesville, Virginia, before they got to the James River. At the James River, there were Confederate patrols to intercept bands of deserters. And let me just add that, in fact, Lee's army, I believe, was melting away after Gettysburg. Melting away. When Futch and his comrades got to the river, they were intercepted by a North Carolinians, a patrol. Futch's men, it appears, tried to surrender, but a gun battle went on. The arresting officer of the other party was killed. Futch, his comrades, captured. They're doomed. They're sent to Richmond, Virginia, to Castle Thunder. In less than a week, they're tried, they're convicted, and of course the sentence, execution before a firing squad. They are not told of the verdict. They are not allowed to communicate with their family or their comrades. They were escorted from Castle Thunder, again in Richmond. The Confederate press was right there to take it all in. They described the men, Futch and his fellow comrades, as looking hard. Of course, the press immediately was conveying, depicting these soldiers just as deserters, not just men who had in fact broken their sense of duty, but men who were at heart criminals. Futch and his comrades were then put on a train, sent back to the Army's camp. His division was near Montpelier. Maybe some of you visited Montpelier, home of James Madison. At Montpelier, the entire division, Johnson's division, that had attacked here at Gettysburg and Culp's Hill, was formed in a hollow square. The night before, Futch and his comrades were told of the verdict. According to the Richmond papers, these were men without religion, of course. That's highly doubtful, especially because in Futch's own letters to his wife and his wife's response, time and time again, they put their future in the hands of Providence. He came from a deeply evangelical family. Nonetheless, the Confederate press took some sort of satisfaction in the fact that Futch and his comrades were baptized. They then were, of course, marched out in front of Johnson's entire division. It was a drilling field. Around Johnson's division were woods, then the opening, and then, of course, Futch and his comrades were marched into the center of that square. It was a very solemn occasion. They marched to the deadbeat, and then when they stopped, each soldier was tied to an individual stake. Those stakes were spaced about 20 feet apart. There were only 10. There were 11 soldiers who initially deserted. One of those men was wounded in the gun battle in the exchange along the James River. He was not executed. When I was doing research on this, I found Johnson's order to the division on the day of the execution at the Museum of the Confederacy. It's a peculiar order because Johnson explicitly instructed his brigade commanders to make sure that the men witnessing the execution did not bring any ammunition to the ceremony. Of all the things that Civil War soldiers witnessed, the military executions were the most difficult, even if the soldiers believed that the victims were deserving of the crime. What's also interesting is the spatial relationship within the hollow square. General Johnson and his staff were at the very center, and of course they had the Confederate colors with them. This, of course, sent a message to everyone of the supremacy of military and Confederate authority. The troops had to actually wait some time before the Futch and the convicted men appeared, about 20 minutes or so. Also keep in mind that each soldier who was to be executed faced a firing squad of 10 men. So you have 100 men as part of the execution squad, and then 2 reserve companies, each company having 10 men as well. So 120 men prepared to kill Futch and his comrades. The soldiers, Futch and the convicts, they were stopped at the stakes, tied, and then, of course, blindfolded, which has always been sort of a bizarre military procedure, that you blindfold a soldier who's to be executed so they can then face the very men who are killing them. After the men were blindfolded and tied to the stakes, a minister came and said a prayer with the soldiers. There was a hushed silence across the field. Someone then reported that one of the soldiers cried out, "Lord, have mercy. Oh, my poor mother. Oh, save me, save me." Never know if Futch was one of those men pleading for his life. We can only think about or imagine what was going through Futch's mind. Was he thinking about the brother he had lost at Gettysburg? Was he thinking about his wife and his child? Or was he too overcome by terror to even imagine what he held dear to himself in his life? While the condemned begged for mercy, the executioners quickly formed their squads of 10 men. They waited for the command that they had heard countless times on the battlefield. As soon as the officer of the day yelled, "Ready, aim, fire," a ragged volley ripped into the soldiers. When the smoke cleared, 2 of the men were still gasping for air, their bodies shaking with life. The 20 members of the reserve squad were called to the front. They fired repeatedly into the wounded soldiers. Final act of this drama, Johnson's men were then ordered to march by the corpses of all 10 men, to of course impress upon them the great risk in deserting the Army of Northern Virginia. Now, to put this within perspective, this execution, the largest in the history of Lee's army, maybe the largest in the entire war on the Confederate side, was actually a rarity. It was unusual that this kind of violence, lethal violence, was used against deserters, forms of other punishments that were employed. But what's important for us to remember, that the great lesson that was drawn from this act by the Confederate press was covered or conveyed throughout the Confederacy. The Richmond papers wrote extensively about the execution, then other papers throughout the Confederacy, they covered it as well or used the same exact articles. And as I indicated before, the message was simply this, that Futch and his comrades, when they decided that they had had enough, when they decided to take their guns with their cartridge boxes and head back toward North Carolina, when they committed that act, it was not an act of survival. It was not an act in an attempt to help those who were desperate at home. It was, in their eyes, a criminal act. Futch and his comrades, the context in which they left, never, ever discussed or mentioned in Confederate publications. No mention that John had lost his brother at Gettysburg. No mention that he and his comrades were literally starving to death in the Army in Northern Virginia. No mention that the people back home were sending pleading, desperate letters to them. That context was stripped away. And what these men had done, according to the Confederate press, is that they had violated a covenant not just against nation, but a covenant with God. There are, of course, few times when you're a historian and you feel like, in a very sort of clear way, that you're bringing justice to the historical record. This, of course, is one of those moments where we have this amazing, rare opportunity to hear the voice of a man on the periphery, a man estranged from his army, from his society. We get his words. We understand his context. We appreciate his humanity. In the face of overwhelming power in an army, in a society, from a ruling class that was determined to demonize him. But of course, the sad part of this is that when we visit our Civil War battlefields, including Gettysburg, stories like John Futch's rarely ever surface to the top. They just don't fit well, especially during this 150th. We're so bent on celebrating this 150th as a time of freedom, a new birth of freedom, that we're forgetting about all these other difficult, challenging, complex stories that just don't support that arc of progress. And so I'll leave you with this thought. We leave Gettysburg always with the words of Abraham Lincoln echoing in our mind. They are inspiring, powerful words about a new birth of freedom. I hope we don't forget them. They resonated, they meant something to white and black Americans at the time. But we also need to remind ourselves that Abraham Lincoln said that none of these men here at Gettysburg who died did not die in vain. John Futch would have disagreed with the president. Thank you. All right, we have some time for questions, comments, or you disagree. This time, we have a mic there. We do need to sort of go to the mics now, if you don't mind. Yeah.
John Lustrio, Chicago, Illinois. So, if you feel like these semi-educated letters and stories like John Futch and these complicated stories don't, we don't talk about them much because they don't fit well with how we want to see the Civil War. Where is the place for these stories? How would you, how do you work them into the overall narrative of the Civil War?
Right. How do you work these stories into the overall narrative of the Civil War? This is what I would do. On our battlefields and in our books, you try to show concurrent narratives so that you can juxtapose how a man such as William Rowan Aylett, who fought at Pickett's Charge, he drew from that experience. He also drew from the hardships of what his wife was experiencing on the home front, and he turned it into the grand narrative of the slaveholding class. And that was, we are heroic men. We got defeated here at Gettysburg, not by the Yankees, but by their what? By their position. Our honor's intact. And the women suffering at home, you're enduring a lot, but you're doing it for the right cause. You have that narrative next to the narrative of someone like Futch, and you can see how people who share the same historical space make radically different meanings of it. So that you're not trying to come up with one dominant narrative. That's what we want. And we have done that in this 150th, because the new birth of freedom now is a thing that we're all hanging our hats on. And again, I'm relieved, overjoyed actually, that we're not back in the centennial, where we're not continuing or dealing with the emancipationist legacy. We're dealing with it now, and I think we're dealing with it quite successfully. But we don't need a single grand narrative to define how we understand this war, and I take that time to break it up.
This is actually no mic, so
I'll get your question.
I'm just wondering, the tone of that, there's a lot of threat in there with people back home. I'm wondering, in terms of don't encourage desertion. The question is there a lot of discussion at this time in the press or public emphasis on this issue, or was this just a random thing?
It's a very good observation. He's referring to the newspaper account in which the people who are also culpable for the act of desertion are the people back home. It was very, very common, especially in the South. And so they pinned this on Southern women all the way to the end. And if only Southern women would buck up and stop complaining that they're starving, right? Or that they're facing, Yankee raids, then all will be well. So once again, what does this skirt? It skirts the structural problems that plague the Confederacy, and it also skirts the fact that there are people in control and power who are making decisions and who are not up to the task right now. This puts the blame and the onus back on the individual. And what's so striking to me is even Army Lee plays this hand. And his army is dissolving around him. He writes contradictory letters about that. But he truly believed that character should ultimately prevail despite the hardship and the misery. And of course, that seems to us like a dislocation of mind. Now, he was certainly concerned about the condition and the welfare of his soldiers and did everything he could to improve it. But the bottom line simply is that Lee's class perspective, made it impossible for him to empathize with someone like John Futch. For him to ultimately recognize that these men who were leaving his army did it not because of a Sam Brand act of disloyalty against the Confederacy. Ultimately, that wasn't a fact. But it was John Futch taking a stand against the Confederacy when he deserted. I would say yes. In a high ideological way? Probably not. Is that letter that we read political? Deeply so. Overwhelmingly so. It just doesn't take the form that we expect. And when we deny that politicization of that letter, we're doing exactly what Lee did. Because rather than see these men as soldiers who are trying to not just survive, but that they are also in a situation that was beyond their control, Lee, of course, discards it, dismisses it as these are just men who have weak character. And then they start to point the finger at civilians and those back on the home. Yeah.
I think it's important to note that in today's military, the training is very thorough. And they break you down, break you away from the home aspect, and they try to make you a coherent unit with people that you don't know so that your family is your unit. But in the Civil War, it was different, especially in the Confederate Army, because when you were a volunteer, you tended to volunteer with men from your community so that your neighbors were serving with you, and then you did have some sort of a support group. Whereas conscripts, maybe not quite so much. They wouldn't be fighting with their neighbors and with their family members. And so I was wondering if you would talk about Futch as a conscript, a man without any kind of a support group and without the training that might have helped him get through that.
I think you make a good initial point. The fact that he's a conscript says something about his reluctancy to support the Confederacy. So from the moment that he entered Confederate ranks, this guy has shaky allegiance to the cause. His support network, we really can't speak to that because we're not exactly sure. He had his brother next to him. I suspect that there were other people from his community within the 3rd North Carolina. and also the degree of training that he received. I mean, he became, in essence, a seasoned veteran. I mean, again, that's what's lost here. Isn't it a shame? Look at his war record. Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville wasn't his first battle. I think I said that. It was actually Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg. Did this man not do exactly what was expected of him as a so-called dutiful soldier? So in terms of his training, he did what he needed to do. All that's lost here. They don't mention any of that. It's just a man who, of course, has abandoned the cause. So I would say that him being a conscript and his weak political attachments certainly made him more vulnerable to the distresses that he experienced in the ranks as well as back on the home front. And so his decision, his departure, I would say yes, it's a political act. It's a political act against the Confederacy, without a question. But it's embedded in the chaos and the confusion of his daily life in the ranks and what's happening back home.
Peter, just a personal question. I know you didn't write this paper after you heard Jerry Gallagher couldn't be here. We appreciate it.
Yes, thank you.
Is this published? That's my question. Is it being published or is it published?
Yeah, it is. This is part of a book that I hope will come out before I retire. It's my goal right now, called The War for the Common Soldier. War for the Common Soldier. University of North Carolina will publish it. And it is a story that, it is a book that focuses, not exclusively, but on men who are on the periphery. So, for example, a New York soldier who enlisted in 1862, left his wife and 6 kids in upstate New York, and as soon as he got into the Army, he's left his family in an absolute desperate situation. She writes him these just pathetic letters of people stealing from them. But here's again the interesting part of the stories we often know here. He deserts after Fredericksburg, and he writes a letter. I can't emphasize this enough. He's poor, semi-literate. He's not constrained by literary styles. It just comes out. And it's jagged and it's raw, it's disorienting, and there's no resolution. But you read that and you're like, good God, what has this guy just gone through? He writes, quote, I saw a man whose brains splattered over an officer. Read that very often. He gets slightly wounded at Fredericksburg, and then in January he deserted and makes it back to Canada. And I have letters from his wife to him while he's in Canada. And they are just heartbreaking. She's right, we're starving. You've got to come down and save us. We are starving. And I can't go on. And those are the stories that will be at the heart of the book when it comes out. Yeah.
Hi there, I'm Glenn Lefkowitz from Bethesda, Maryland. I have a more generic question for you who are historians. Everything hearing, what we read, what you're describing, based on facts. Now in the future, they now, the internet, Twitter, email, there are things are not basically the same. What is the future for historians, the future of research?
The question is, if you didn't hear that, is what's the future for historians in dealing with source material that now is so diffuse through tweets, through emails, through blogs, and archives have, I think, very adeptly moved in digital archiving. And of course, it's beyond my pay grade to be able to explain to you the technology that is involved. But there certainly is a sensitivity and awareness of being able to preserve that kind of material. My fear would be is that it's so utterly overwhelming, I don't know how you can wade through it all. So there will be all kinds of challenges, to be sure. But the act of preservation, it appears to me that the archival community is certainly trying to meet that challenge. And the idea that all this material is just going to be lost, I can't imagine that happening. The problem would be, how do you wade through it? Yeah.
David Rosen from Alexandria, Virginia. Is there work that breaks down the group of people on both sides who work as areas, both by class and any other kind of education and various categories like that, where there's also middle class, upper class?
That's right. The question is, in terms of the act of desertion, how does that collective of class, and what kind of statistical analysis have we done to bring some clarity to those people who maybe were disposed or to do that? Joe Blacktar has done statistical analysis in 2 volumes on these armies that can speak to that issue. Aaron Sheehan Dean will be speaking to you all this evening. He has done a fair amount of work on that as well. I think Aaron would probably disagree with me in this way, and maybe not, we'll find out tonight. I think that the social class is the key determinator and who ultimately will run, in large part because if you are a person of influence or affluence, and you are an officer or a non-commissioned officer, there are a lot of ways to wiggle out of the Army and to do it legitimately. For someone who's poor, who's on the margins, who lacks those connections, they are stuck in the muck of war, and they often have to then resort to what we would call more dramatic acts of political dissent. But Aaron can speak a little bit more, I think, precisely to the numbers, but it is my sense from the scholarship that clearly social class has a direct connection to those who are predisposed to deserting. And let me just make a point. This is not a rich man's war, poor man's fire. It's not that at all, especially on the Confederate side. There are plenty of men in Futch's class who the thought of surrendering to the Yankees and living in a world without slavery is an unthinkable one. An unthinkable one. So Stephanie McCurry did a book called Confederate Reckoning. There's lots of good things in that book, but where the book falls wildly short is this portrait of poor people almost unified in a 1960s, like, fight the power sort of way. And I think that, of course, just doesn't at all fit the reality of how there are overlapping, again, allegiances. She focuses on poor Confederate women in Richmond. Did they take to the streets for bread riots in the spring of 1863? Of course they did. But these are the very same women who identified themselves as soldiers' wives. Right? Do you think they wanted the Confederate Army to succeed? Of course they did, because they knew that the best chance for their husbands to get back home was for Lee's army to be victorious. These are the same women, though, who are taking to the streets, clamoring against the Davis administration. And it goes back to my initial point. To know and not know, to be contradictory. There's a good example of that. We don't see much of that in Stephanie McCurry's work. It is a unified working class against the Confederate government. Joe, would be our last question.
Joe Cook, Pagoda, New Jersey. It seems like every once in a while, maybe once a year, Robert E. Lee just decided he needed one of these public and publicized executions. Last year he talked about Stonewall Jackson's soldiers being executed in 1862. How did Lee determine that it was time for one of these very rare public executions?
There's always tension between Lee and Jefferson Davis, as there was with Abraham Lincoln and his generals, as the best way of dealing with this problem, because you can't shoot them all, can you? Because if you try to shoot them all, you'll have an absolute insurgency on the home front. So after Gettysburg, Lee's grappling with this problem. They came up with, in essence, was a system to pardon men, which completely, in its execution, was botched. Soldiers misunderstood it. Those in the ranks thought that they could actually desert and be pardoned. So it resulted in a spike of desertion in an attempt to actually bring people back and to give them forgiveness. So it completely unraveled. And so Lee and Davis certainly went back and forth, but what the Futch case allowed Lee to do was just kind of a black and white matter. A Confederate officer had been killed in arresting these soldiers. Nobody was going to be able to dispute that. So, of course, Lee, in his mind, understandably, was working within the code of military justice. He had a clear-cut issue here, and the execution of 10 men certainly sent a powerful message. But that didn't stop Lee's army from leaking soldiers. There's a wonderful account of a civilian from Lynchburg writing to Richmond, complaining about the spike in desertion, and that all these men are flooding to the mountains of southwest Virginia. Of course, there, in essence, they would be free from the hand of the Army of Northern Virginia. And this civilian said that every time they meet a deserting soldier, they stopped the soldier and said, "Where's your pass?" And the soldier would point to his gun and say, "Here's my pass." And of course, they let him go on his way. So there was a real crisis, and Lee, using Futch and his comrades, was an easy thing to do because the violation of military justice was something that no one would question. All right. Thank you so much.